Hello and welcome to another video. My name is CJ, the Populist New Yorker, and today we're going to be looking at the possible candidates for the 2024 Republican presidential primary and analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of these candidates geographically across the country and which candidate out of these five that I've chosen would be the most electable. Now, according to Wikipedia, there's a lot more than five Republican presidential candidates, but the ones I've put on here I think are the most likely. These won't be the only candidates to run, but I think they're the most likely to actually possibly get somewhere. And, you know, some of these candidates like Charlie Baker, Larry Hogan, I don't really think they would survive very long in a Republican primary because they are significantly to the left of the Republican base. And other people like Tim Scott and, by extension, someone like Tom Cotton would probably have more trouble with name recognition. Maybe not Tom Cotton so much. Both of the Trumps I don't think would run for president either. But again, this is just my early speculation on the primary so far. So first we'll look at the Dan Crenshaw. Now Dan Crenshaw is I don't want to say, I guess is sort of a more moderate Republican. He's more of a neoconservative, essentially. When it comes to foreign policy, he is very pro regime change wars, stuff like that. He's more of the Bushite type conservative. He plays the role of like the establishment candidate. Now, his biggest flaw right off the bat is that he's only been in Congress since 2019. Therefore, even by 2024, being somebody that's only a representative in the House for 5 years isn't really sufficient in a lot of people's minds to become president. With that being said, though, areas where he'd perform well, obviously, his home state of Texas. And I'm going to analyze these candidates isolated, not all together, because, if we were to do a detailed primary prediction by margins and everything, we would be here forever. And I don't know exactly if the delegate map changes every 4 years. I'm not actually that informed when it comes to primaries. However, I do think Dan Crenshaw would probably win his home state of Texas on his own, and probably do good in some nearby areas like Oklahoma. If we look at the 2020 election map to get a sense of the type of candidate that he is. Now, I don't think he would have the same broad appeal as somebody like Ted Cruz did in certain parts of the country. Ted Cruz performed really well in more traditionally conservative areas, some parts of the South and some parts of the Midwest here. But I think areas where Dan Crenshaw would be particularly strong would be places like Texas, by extension Oklahoma, and honestly, I don't really think a whole lot else. Dan Crenshaw is one of those candidates that's tricky to gauge at the moment because he is essentially just a younger version of the traditional GOP establishment, just repackaged differently with a different approach. There's not a whole lot that makes Dan Crenshaw stand out from these candidates besides his extensive military experience. So I don't really know where else he would do particularly well. But, again, we could look at somebody like Ted Cruz, for instance. Let's look at some of the states Ted Cruz. He won Oklahoma. He also won areas like Alaska. Now, the thing about Ted Cruz and Dan Crenshaw that are different was Ted Cruz was running more as a evangelical conservative Republican, and Dan Crenshaw is likely not going to take that route. So, for now, if I look at the states that Trump or Dan Crenshaw won, honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if Dan Crenshaw did very well in a place like Iowa or something, because they tend to vote kind of for, very strange candidates. And when I mean strange, I mean more of the unknown. Like, for instance, in 2016, the Iowa caucus went to Ted Cruz. He didn't end up being the nominee, so it was really interesting to see that all play out. But really, that's about it. Perhaps Dan Crenshaw would do better in a state like, a Nebraska or a Montana or something like that. But I don't really see him appealing to areas like Utah, the Southwest particularly, all that much. So we'll clear him off the map. I don't really think Dan Crenshaw is a very strong candidate out of the gate. Ted Cruz is also from the state of Texas, so obviously we're going to give Ted Cruz the state of Texas. But the thing about Ted Cruz that is really interesting that it will be his second time in a Republican primary. So there's a lot of states where I think Ted Cruz would normally perform very poorly, will normally perform fairly well, but the difference is he's already run once before, and it's usually very hard to gain more traction. Of course, you could point to some notable exceptions. Ronald Reagan, he ran for the presidency 3 times before capturing the nomination and winning in the general election. And of course, you could also look to somebody like Mitt Romney. He ran in 2008. He lost the nomination. He ran again in 2012 and won the nomination. Also, John McCain, same deal. So, I mean, the only thing that makes me think that Ted Cruz will actually be a stronger candidate in the primary is the fact that he's built much more of a national persona than he did prior to 2016. Prior to 2016, not a lot of people knew who Ted Cruz was. You know, he was the guy who read Green Eggs and Ham on the floor of the Senate. That was all people really knew about him. But Ted Cruz, I think, would actually perform really well in some traditionally conservative states, places like Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, possibly, I meant to give that to Ted Cruz. Tennessee, we're just going to do Phil because I don't really want to, that's better. Yeah, because I'm not going to do the amounts here. But places like Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, possibly a Georgia as well. I think Ted Cruz's biggest strengths are going to be in the Bible Belt sort of part of the country. And if we look at the areas he did particularly well in, it was the Bible Belt. Possibly even a place like Kansas, traditionally goes for more, traditional conservatives, or Den Crenshaw would also be pretty strong in the state of Kansas as well. But I think Ted Cruz's biggest strengths are going to be here in the South in the country, the religious parts of the country. Even by extension, Ted Cruz might be able to inch his way up in a place like a Missouri, and Indiana, Kentucky. I don't really think Ted Cruz would do that great in West Virginia, particularly. But again, we're looking at these isolatedly. But I think these would be his strongest areas in terms of support. Now we're going to move on to Josh Hawley. Josh Hawley is a really interesting individual, and he's not on this list of potential candidates, which I find kind of odd because a lot of people have been floating his name around for a long time. It's probably because he hasn't announced or said really anything on the topic, but a lot of people have been trying to put his name out there. Josh Hawley is kind of trying to run as more of a populist Republican. He's more friendly, at least in rhetoric, to things like economic populism, tariffs, somewhat of a more liberal approach when it comes to healthcare, trade, taxes, stuff like that. So he's more of a progressive conservative type. However, in rhetoric, of course, but in action, he's not that much different from your run-of-the-mill Republican. Of course, he'll do really well. He'll do really well in his home state of Missouri. And honestly, with his sort of populist messaging, I think he'll do very well in the plains part of the country. He'll do very well in places like Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, etc. Areas like that. I think he'd perform very strongly. Colorado as well, he'd do really well in. New Mexico, not so much. New Mexico tends to back more of the establishment Republicans, and also their primary is quite late. But I think his biggest strengths are here in the breadbasket of the country. Maybe in Iowa. I don't know about Minnesota. But definitely in Iowa or something like that, he would do particularly well in. Now, of course, we come to Vice President Mike Pence. Now, Vice President Mike Pence for Republicans, I think, would be a very poor nomination choice. And the reason I think that is, again, is because Mike Pence represents the old guard, old-fashioned conservative, Bushite conservative, evangelical, not really that populist on certain economic issues, which is becoming somewhat more popular in the Republican Party, although not as popular as I think it ought to be. But somebody like Mike Pence is more of a, again, he would take the role of a Ted Cruz. So, of course, places Mike Pence would do really well in. Oh, we got to fill this in. Mike Pence would do really well in places like Indiana, Kentucky, and, we could basically sweep most of the South here. Perhaps Texas as well. They like conservatives like Mike Pence. And again, he's the establishment choice. I think Utah, he'd do fairly well. I don't think I put Utah for Ted Cruz, but Ted Cruz would have also done fairly well in Utah. Places like Illinois. I don't really think he'd do as well in a New York, but definitely a place like Ohio, West Virginia. Well, actually, no, not West Virginia. I think Josh Hawley would do better in West Virginia. But I think his strengths would be more in the Midwestern part of the state. He'd probably pick up a place like California because he's a very not conservative, a very establishment candidate. Arizona, especially, Nevada as well. He would do very well in these parts of the country, I think, and also South Carolina, Virginia, certainly. So with that alone, Mike Pence would probably win the nomination. Some of the earlier primaries I think he'd do very well in is probably a place like not really a New Hampshire, but certainly an Iowa, a South Carolina definitely, and a Nevada. I think Mike Pence would be really strong just in the southern half of the United States as an entity itself. Really not so strong in Alaska or Hawaii, being he's more of a evangelical type candidate, but certainly really strong in these states. Now, finally, we'll go to the last potential candidate that I think is very likely to run, and it is Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley is probably the most left on the political spectrum that is running, but she's not left-wing by any sense of the imagination. She's just more of a neoconservative type like Dan Crenshaw. Not really friendly to populist economic ideas, more so of the continue wars in the Middle East, stuff like that. So a very neoconservative candidate. Now, I think Nikki Haley especially would do very well among blue states, so places like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, South Carolina, maybe. Probably South Carolina just because it's her home state. But certainly her strengths would be in a lot of the blue states ideologically. Maybe not Delaware, because Delaware tends to back more of the conservative Republicans. But certainly a place like a Maryland, a Vermont, possibly. Well, maybe not. I definitely think she'd do well in New England, though, given that she's more of a liberal sort of Republican. Anywhere else in the heartland, I mean, she possibly could do well regionally in a place like Georgia, perhaps. Maybe a Florida or something like that. But, overall, I don't really think she has a lot of appeal anywhere else in the country besides the eastern half. And we didn't really get to talk much about the West Coast. But perhaps I'll do a future video where I analyze all these candidates together and do like kind of a mock primary prediction with these candidates. But anyway, this video was just a quick kind of very impromptu, informal kind of just gauging where I personally think the candidates will be strong. Again, we didn't go over all the states because some states tend to drift towards the winner. I was just basing this more on the ideologies of the given states in a Republican primary and how they would vote. So if you enjoyed this video, please leave a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification to not miss another video. So please subscribe, really helps this channel out, motivates me to make more videos. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you in